This podcast is brought to you in partnership with Eva International Media Ltd. Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virts, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth. If you love the podcast, please subscribe or give us a rating. Today, we have an amazing guest, Dr. Julia Minson. She is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where she is a decision scientist with research interest in conflict negotiations and judgment and decision making. So, Julia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
You're one of the reading your bio makes me feel like what have I done with my life? One of those underachievers. You've got Harvard and Wharton, Penn, University of Pennsylvania, Stanford. That's kind of crazy.
Well, I've gone to a lot of school, but I've never gone into space. So,
well, that's there's good and bad, I guess, about both. Actually, I do some guest lecturing at the business school, so I'm going to be there in a few weeks. Maybe I'll get a chance to say hi in person because you're in Cambridge right now, right?
I am in Cambridge. Yeah, it would be great.
Just across the river. You have a really amazing background. I read an article. The way we got in touch is I read an article. I think it was in the Harvard Journal. And can you tell us a little bit about your background? Because you wouldn't necessarily know it from listening to you speak.
Yes, absolutely. So I think what you're probably referring to is that I was born in the former Soviet Union, and I came to the States in middle school. And a lot of people point out that I have no accent. I have a tiny little bit of an accent. You have to kind of listen for it. But I came to the States because my mother, who was a Russian psychologist, married an American psychologist. And so we came with him to Denver, Colorado, where there were virtually no people from Russia at that time. This was the very early 1990s. And so that was kind of a tough immigration experience, but, Denver public schools did me right. And that's how I ultimately ended up going to Harvard and sort of following in the family trade, becoming a psychologist.
I'll tell you, when I was in space, it's a funny story. I was floating through the middle of the station one day and I heard this bird chirping. And I thought, this is weird. There's no birds here. So Misha Kornienko, the cosmonaut, was working out. And I said, Misha, do you have a bird in there? And he laughed. The Russian psychologist had sent him sounds from Earth. So they had jungle sounds and like waves lapping on a shore and rain. And the most amazing one was a cafe, just people clinging glasses and talking, just ambient noise at a cafe. And I always found that the Russian psychologists were really, really, really good. They understood the human, Chelovachestva, right? The humanity of spaceflight. It was interesting. They get some things very wrong, obviously, but they get that part of life pretty good.
Yeah. Well, in general, I mean, Russians, tend to be pretty good at science, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you were in America without speaking a word of English, or had you learned English in school?
No, it's funny. So I learned English in school as sort of my, foreign language, but imagine imagine the level that you come with in sixth grade when you took it in elementary school. And of course, what they taught in Russia was British English.
Right.
So I had like a weird Russian British accent, and we came in May of 1990, and my mother tricked me. We came to the States on Saturday. I kid you not. We landed on a Saturday on a flight from Moscow to JFK to Denver, Colorado, and on Tuesday she took me to see my new school. And the premise was that we were just going to go and see. And so, they take me to the principal's office, and the principal says, well, while we talk here, while the adults talk, let me introduce you to a student who can sort of show you around, and they call this girl who was like, one of those straight A honor roll types, who to this day is one of my closest friends. And she walks me out of the principal's office and walks me into a classroom, and they sit me down, and there I am. And first day of American school, and all of a sudden I'm there full day. And
oh my
and
God.
that was that.
That's the way to do it. I have a neighbor that has the Russian son. He came here when he was 5 or 6, and he's 8 now. Unbelievable. Speaks perfect English. It's amazing. Kids, your neurons are still connecting. You understand that better than me, but like when I was in the Air Force, people would send their kids to German kindergarten without speaking a word of German, and after a year, they were German. I mean, it's amazing how much kids can learn.
Right.
I'll tell you, as I learned Russian in my 30s and 40s, the first decade was the hardest, and it's not like being 10 when you're 40. There's a big difference, at least for me.
Right. Yeah. And it seems so unfair, right? Because in all the immigrant families, the adults are just working like hell to pick up English.
Right.
And all that work doesn't give them anything compared to what the kids get from just no effort at all.
Right. Plus the way we learn cases in Russian is, подъезжи, it was so terrible. It was like learning it from an engineering point of view. Whereas anyway, so we could do a whole thing about the Russian language and how to learn it. But let's not do that. It was painful. And then I kind of got over a hill, and then like I needed it and I wanted it. I wanted to speak more Russian. It was a interesting process. But what I want to talk about today is obviously the Ukraine conflict is what's been on everybody's mind. And you have some interesting psychological insights. I want to talk about propaganda, why people believe it. How can you kind of unwrap their brain when they're go down that rabbit hole? I want to talk about how we might resolve this conflict. There's a lot of psychological insights. So, and you had an op-ed come out today. So do you want to describe that, what your thesis was in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had an op-ed come out today in Time magazine. And the op-ed is really talking about some work that I've been doing with a project called Mail2RU. So it's mail, the number 2, RU.org. And the idea behind the project is to try to help people in Russia gain access to independent media. Right. Mm-hmm. So as you know, President Putin has shut down most independent journalists in Russia, the independent newsrooms. There's still some people, broadcasting things on YouTube and Telegram, but really the access to independent information is pretty much gone. And what's interesting is that what's not gone is people's ability to communicate sort of to their peers, right? So there's friends and there's relatives who are still calling Russia, directly emailing their friends, they're, texting their friends, all these sorts of things. And so the idea behind this project was to sort of leverage that technology and leverage that willingness of people to just communicate person to person to try to make a small dent in the propaganda. Mm-hmm. And so this was started by a guy in Norway, actually, who is, mm-hmm. a tech entrepreneur. Right. And he scraped millions of Russian email addresses off the internet. I mean, who knows what's out there about all of us, right?
Right.
And the system that he built is very, very clever in its simplicity, which is that there's a button on the website. You go to mail2ru.org. There's a button, you click the button. It opens your own email client. So like if you did it, it would open your own email and it would be pre-populated with a bunch of Russian email addresses and a message in Russian advocating against the war in Ukraine and pointing people to, here's how you download software to protect yourself from government surveillance. And then once you have, a VPN installed, here's how you get out to, the New York Times or the BBC or Radio Free Europe or, whatever may be your preference. And so I heard about all of this through actually one of the postdocs that works in my lab.
Mm-hmm.
We were all kind of talking about the conflict. We're brainstorming about what we can do. We were talking about, should we start a fundraising effort? Should we, do something for refugees? And she sent this to me. And so I went to the website and I clicked on the button and I read the message and I thought, they solved the technical problem, but what of course they didn't consider is the psychology. Right. And so that's how I got involved, was sort of recognizing that the social sciences have a ton to say about how you persuade people of things that they don't want to believe. I mean, this is literally what we do all day long as we study, we study persuasion, and there's a huge market for it in marketing and advertising, of course. But, from the standpoint of conflict resolution negotiations, we actually do know quite a bit. And so I thought, let's take our bag of tricks and kind of put it to this task where you have the technology. And at this point, there's 500,000 people around the world who are clicking on the button, on mail to RU. So we have willing people wanting to help. We have the tech set up to do it. Can we sort of bridge the last mile by being smart about what the messaging is? Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of how I got involved, and that's what we've been doing.
Okay, so let's talk about how to change that, because I've been trying to. I have, I don't have millions of followers, but I've got hundreds of thousands of followers, and a lot of them are Russian, and so I've been trying to post the truth, what I perceive as the truth, which is BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, whatever. And I've also been very critical, to say the least, of Russia. I won't be traveling there anytime soon. Is that helpful, or is it? I'm guessing it's not helpful. I'm guessing what my technique of using social media. So what are those Jedi mind tricks that you what are that you're using?
Jedi mind trick sounds a little bit more nefarious than what we're going for, but
the good Jedi, not the bad Jedi, not the
good Jedi. That's right, the good Jedi. So I mean, part of it, right? Kind of, I think a really fundamental thing that we all need to keep in mind is that people who believe things that we think are crazy, they think they believe the truth, right? So when we say truth, they also think truth, mm-hmm. right? And so the things that we believe to be completely self-evident, they're like, no, here's my self-evident truth, right? And so you can think of, you can kind of segment your sort of target audience in a few different ways, right? So you have the people who were listening to the independent media, and who were sort of anti the Putin regime to start with, right? And half of those people are now out of Russia anyway, right? Yeah. But in a sense, like they're not our target audience, right? Because they already believe it, right?
Preaching to the choir.
We're preaching to the choir, right? And then there's the people who are sort of the hardcore Putin supporters, who kind of bought the whole thing, right? And that's also, I mean, it would be nice to sway some of those folks, but that's really, really hard, right? So, I mean, very much like, in campaigning in the US, right? You're thinking like, who is persuadable, and can we actually get them to do something?
The undecided voters, right?
Right. Is there such a thing as an undecided voter? Right. If we can find them, can we get them to actually vote? And so those kinds of people, right? If you send them, sort of graphic images and, dead civilians, mm-hmm. If you accuse Russia of war crimes, like, they don't want to deal with it on their, morning commute. They don't want to hear about it. Part of the reason they're undecided is because they're sort of staying out of the fray and they don't care. So what we've been really trying to do is meet people where they are, right? So say something like, hey, I'm writing from abroad because I'm concerned about the situation. Here's what I've read in our Western media. Do you think it's true? What have you read? We've heard that, Western media is no longer allowed in Russia. Why do you think that is? Right? So there's a lot of sort of recognizing that people are mentally in a very different place, right? And if you just sort of present them with the facts that are diametrically opposed to their beliefs, you're mostly going to get them to dismiss it, right? Because it's sort of like, well, you're telling me black is white and white is black. This is too complicated. I'm done, right? I'm going to delete the email. So we are doing a few things. We're keeping it very short. We are acknowledging people from where they are and their perspectives, right? Like, I understand that things are really hard in Russia right now because of the Western sanctions, right? How has that affected you, right? Or we understand that a lot of people in Russia believe that there are, Nazis running Ukraine. How do you think that reconciles with the fact that, their president is Jewish and a large number of his family members died in the Holocaust, right? So sort of question asking and engagement and dialogue, as opposed to kind of telling people how things are.
I feel better because recently that's what I've been doing on Instagram, asking questions like, why do you think Putin has shut down all the press or stuff like that? So when they email back, though, they're emailing in Russian. And so what if you're not a fluent Russian speaker? You just use Google Translate, I guess?
Yeah. So, sort of both the beauty and the frustration of this particular setup is that there's volunteers all over the world who are sending these emails. So the replies are not coming to me, they're coming to them. Right. And so, yes, Google Translate is
it's good, by the way.
It's good. Right.
I've been using it and I always check it to make sure it's saying the right thing. And as best I can tell, it's been really, really, I have to change a word or two here or there, but it's a lot better now than it was a couple of years ago, I think.
Yeah. No, it's gotten a ton better. And sometimes it does funny things, but it's just, you can get the drift, right?
Right.
And the thing that's interesting is that we are inviting people to dialogue, but we're not really expecting them to reply, in the sense that if, the email gets through the spam filters, if the person opens it, if the person reads it, and if the person feels sympathetic, it's still not at all clear that it's safe for them to be replying, because of course they're all using Russian email services. We're all sharing data.
Yandex or whatever. Yeah.
Right. So we are fine with them not replying. What we are really hoping for is that they will download that VPN and go out to, BBC or, Radio Free Europe is starting to use shortwave channels like they did back in the 60s. Right. But sometimes the volunteers forward me things, and it ranges from, comical to heartbreaking. Right.
Radio Free Europe is great, by the way. I did a few interviews with them at the beginning of the war, and the guy, my reporter there, just emailed me last night. They are really good. It's a great organization. Yep.
Big fan. And they have a whole list on their website of ways that you can circumvent surveillance and download news from Russia.
So this is a tough nut to crack. I mean, you're trying to solve, you'd probably have a better time solving peace in the Middle East. It's hard. What is the goal? This is hard. This is my goal. A lot of people, by the way, I want to say this out loud. I love Russia. Like, my time in Russia was wonderful. I love the people. When I was in space, hanging out with the cosmonauts was one of my favorite things. And I know online, I come across as very anti-Russian because I'm 100% anti-Russian, what they're doing right now, government, but culturally and the people, there's a difference between the people, and the people that I know there would never in a million years want to do this. I don't think. They're not at all like that at all. They're very much, they're like Texans. I found they're just kind of practical. They want a good life for their family. Anyway, there's this huge anti-Russian sentiment, and it's going to last for generations. And it's not going to, the Russian brand is doomed for generations, unfortunately, because of Putin. It's because of one man's ego that this happened. So I'm just trying to differentiate the actual human beings there from what their government has decided to do. But so many of them believe in it and are supporting it. And that really, I'm going to say, I'm sorry for talking so much. The worst part about this whole thing, Yulia, is that men and women that I flew with in space, cosmonauts that should be the most enlightened people on the planet. I literally sat there looking out the window in 2015, watching bombs go off in the Donbass with one of these guys. And now they're in the Duma, they're congressmen, they're Russian congressmen, and they all voted for the war. The first woman in space, I'm sure you grew up, Valentina Tereshkova is in the Duma. I went to her museum in Novgorod, what town is it? The one north of Moscow. Anyway, she's the one who introduced the legislation to make Putin president for life. So it's been very frustrating for me to see these people who should be enlightened. They spent years in the West. They know right from wrong. And here they are voting for the war. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's tough on many levels, and Russia is not unique in this way, right? And sort of the story that's playing out right now is not unique. And I think there's a couple ways that there's a lot that psychologists have done to help us understand how these situations evolve, right? So when you're talking about regular Russian people, I've been thinking a lot about, the metaphor about the frog that's getting slowly boiled and doesn't realize that it's being boiled, and so it doesn't jump out of the pot. The independent media has been removed gradually, right? And so as sort of people, get named as sort of enemies of the state and, agents of Western propaganda, and things get shut down, you very slowly lose access to anything but government information. Most people didn't have it, right? I mean, to get, right now we're sending Western media to Russia. Well, we are having a very hard time finding things that are translated or even subtitled in Russian, right? So we think of it as, oh, the internet is there, all this information is available to you. It's actually not. Right? It takes some savvy, it takes knowledge of English, it takes sort of that drive to find this information, right? So most Russians just don't know, right? And so I think it's short-sighted of us to think of an entire country as filled with, people who are doing X, Y, and Z when, they're acting on the best information they have. A lot of them think that the Russian military is heroically liberating Ukraine, right? They literally think that they're saving them from the Nazis. And then I think the people that your former colleagues who are in the Duma, that's a different story, right?
It is
That's
a different story.
Yeah. Because they do have access or had access, right? And so the question becomes, how does the social situation you're in shape your beliefs and shape your behavior, right? And that, that goes back to, like the 1950s and 60s social psychologists and, the Milgram experiment and Phil Zimbardo and all that stuff, because we know from that research that people are very powerfully shaped by their immediate surroundings and their social context.
Does Putin believe it, or does he know it's a lie?
I don't know what Putin believes for obvious reasons. I wouldn't be surprised if he has justified it sufficiently that there are big parts of it that he believes. In the op-ed that I wrote, I drew the analogy of, Russia attacking Ukraine because they used to be one country, to, a domestic abuser breaking into their ex's house because we're family.
Oh my God, right? That's right. Wow. Wow. Well, what's interesting when you look at the history of Russia and the Soviet Union, at least the last century, 100% of countries that were occupied by Russia or Soviet Union want them gone, and they're not welcome back, right? Like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Lithuania, Ukraine, countries like Kazakhstan that are their own dictatorships, and they want help from the strongman. But that's got to tell you something. If the entire world is voting to not have Vejlivi Ludi, is I think the term, Ruski Mir. Nobody wants Ruski Mir. By the way, so is that Russian world or Russian peace or both?
So Mir means world and peace.
Right, Russian. Exactly. Yeah.
I think the phrase means Russian world.
Okay.
Right? Sort of like the greater Russia.
That's one of those things where you can, but there's always been the dissidents or whatever. There's a tradition of people that know that. It's just so I love stepping on toes. It's what I do best. So Russia is not the only country on earth with this problem of propaganda, disinformation.
Indeed.
And this is it. Of all these big ideas that I want to work on and try and make the world a better place, I think this is at the heart of everything. I think this is the most important, is combating disinformation, because vaccine in America, literally hundreds of thousands of Americans died because people were wrong about the vaccine, right? Just disinformation. The election was stolen. We literally tried to overthrow the American government. 90% of Texas GOP congressional candidates in this year, 90% of 2022 candidates believe the election was stolen, or claim that the election was stolen. It's the same thing, Julia. We have the same exact problem. Yes. It's the same problem happening in America.
Yes. Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And in fact, the way I arrived at the work in Russia, right, the stuff I was doing up until then, all had to do with talking across divides in America.
Mm-hmm.
And, the, congressional representatives of Texas, your former colleagues in the Duma, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is to some extent a similar mix of people being exposed to a subset of information that conforms to their prior beliefs, being ensconced in a social group where everybody agrees on the same thing, and having very strong incentives to maintain those beliefs. And, in America, we can't say, well, people have no access to free media, or people can't read English, or, so you see how pervasive those problems are. And with respect to vaccines, what's very, very interesting is, of course, there's a ton of people right now trying to understand how to overcome vaccine hesitancy. And one of the things we've been doing in my lab is actually using the same bag of Jedi tricks, where we've been running experiments online where we find people who are for the vaccine and feel strongly that everybody in the world should be vaccinated. And we find people who are vaccine hesitant, and we put them together, and we have them talk about the vaccine. And we train the pro-vaccine people in what we call conversational receptiveness. So acknowledging the other person's perspective, hedging your own claims, using positive language, not sounding sort of explanatory and condescending. Mm-hmm. And we find a couple of very interesting things. One, we find the conversational receptiveness works better than just giving people the facts about the vaccine.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the other thing that we find that's truly fascinating is that anything works better than nothing.
Right.
Right. So getting an email from some rando on the internet who says, I think you should get vaccinated and here's why, tends to kind of soften people's attitudes towards the vaccines. And it's really interesting, right? Because we avoid these conversations so much because we expect them to go badly.
Right.
But there's real potential in just talking to people.
Right. So in the 90s, I was in the Air Force, and they came up with this anthrax vaccine. So there was like an anthrax, like there was mad cow disease. Anyway, it was a 90s thing for some reason. And the military decided there was this anthrax vaccine, but everybody was like, and I didn't get it, and nobody wanted to get it. And they were like, we're going to force you to get it. And And then all of a sudden it just, I think they realized, hey, this is a bad vaccine. Like it was making people sick and they just stopped it. So that's actually I think if I were going to have that conversation, I would say, I remember in the 90s, there was a vaccine that I didn't want to get. They were going to try and force me, but it really was bad. They looked at the data and they stopped it pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But this one's different. There's been billions of people vaccinated, and it's just, anyway, so that maybe that's a good technique to say, hey, I was on your side too at one point about this other thing, but
right. I get it. Right. I get why you would feel this way. And it's not like entirely crazy. But here's why I disagree. So I think that's really important. And there's sort of a broader framework to think about here, which is to your point about fighting propaganda and what an important problem it is. There is a giant labor force of people in the world who want to tell folks accurate information, right? The vaccine is safe and effective. January 6th was not a bunch of patriots. Biden did not steal the election.
Right. Q is not real. Yeah.
Right. When there's a hurricane coming, you should really evacuate.
Right.
Right. Any of those things. And people have this very strong desire to share the truth with their friends and family and sort of other folks in the world. And I think that strong desire lands them in one of two places. One version is they say, this is never going to work. Those crazies are never going to listen to me. I'm avoiding this conversation. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's a economist named Keith Chen at UCLA who does this like amazing work with geolocating people using their cell phones. And he has shown that since 2016, Thanksgiving dinners have gotten half an hour shorter. Right. Because people are just like, the topic comes up and they're out of there. Right. Yeah. But the other version is the people who are very eager to engage. Mm-hmm. They're the ones that start jumping up and down and screaming about, what an idiot you are and how, you shouldn't be afraid of being tracked by the, microchip in the vaccine, because of course you're carrying your iPhone around and you're tracked already. Right. I was like, how can you possibly believe this craziness? Right. Yeah, there you go. You're being tracked by the government.
Not only they're then listened to, probably, they're
right. So there's these two extremes. There's we avoid the conversation, or we end up having a screaming match,
yelling.
And then after that, we avoid the conversation. Mm-hmm. So imagine if we took all these people and gave them a toolkit for having these conversations in a thoughtful, civil manner. Right.
Amazing. I'm listening.
That's my big, like, change the world project. Can we, we have the psychological know-how. There's all these people who seem to want to share accurate information. Can we organize them? Can we train them? And then can we say, okay, friend, email 10 of your friends and family, mm-hmm. and make sure that we're all on the same page. And have a conversation, right? Have a conversation. Let them come back to you with what their reasoning is, what their beliefs are. Let's like all do some research together. Let's be thoughtful about it.
And I think if you can try and meet someone like, yeah, I know, like I sort of believed what you believe too, or if you can find some common ground, like my anthrax story. Hey, there was a vaccine that I didn't want to get. I get that. If it was the 1700s and the vaccine was, I'm going to give you smallpox and hopefully you don't die, there's only a 10% chance you're going to die, I would be hesitant about that vaccine. But right. This is not that vaccine. And so maybe let them know that, they're not entirely crazy. And I can sort of see your point. Like the Russians, when they went into Crimea, a lot of people there wanted them there. Like that, I think that was a legitimate, there were actually people in Crimea that wanted the Russians there. And the Ukrainian government was pretty bad. It was corrupt, Ukraine was not a perfect angel. So there were some things about that made sense. It's the 21st century. You shouldn't just go annex countries. That was wrong. And the reason he did it was he got so offended that Ukraine booted out his puppet. Remember Poroshenko? I forgot. Yeah. So anyway, so if you can, maybe that's a good technique to, I can sort of see where you're coming from, because I was there too. Well,
another thing, so like my brother-in-law did not want to get vaccinated, like for love or money, just did not want to do it. He is one of these, natural lifestyle
Right.
people, like
Joe
fresh
Rogan.
air and sunshine,
Right.
and, taking a deep cleansing breath will stop COVID. And my whole family is like jumping up and down and yelling at him. And eventually I thought, well, why does he, like, what's his problem with the vaccine? What, like, has anybody asked him?
Right.
Right. And so I asked him, and he texted me this list of reasons why he felt uncomfortable with the vaccines. And one of the things he said, I mean, this was, probably almost a year ago at this point, but he said, look, and I've heard this argument many times, it hasn't been fully tested because it's emergency authorization. It's not like real authorization.
Right.
And my immediate reaction was like, well, that's nonsense. And then my second reaction was, I actually don't know the difference between emergency authorization and the full thing. Right. And it frankly took me hours to figure it out. Yeah. It took me a long time to figure out the difference. And I would bet that the vast majority of people who say, look, the vaccines are great, they're safe and effective, they're FDA approved, they actually don't know the answer to that question, right? Turns out the answer to that question, by the way, is that the full authorization spends a lot more time examining the manufacturing process. So they go to like the factories and like look at how the labels are printed. And so part of the reason it takes a lot longer is that it has nothing to do with the medicine anymore. It has to do with the manufacturing.
So why wasn't the CDC telling us that? Why wasn't Fauci telling us that? That's a great point. They didn't talk to you. They didn't talk to you.
This is my point in the op-ed, in the Time op-ed with regard to Ukraine, but I think it's a much broader point. People in social sciences do this all day long, right? And since, the CDC, I feel for them. I would not want their job in a million years.
No. Yeah.
But, we have people in every university in the US who do marketing and persuasion and psychology for a living.
Right.
So we should have gotten those people involved on day one when we said we want people to wear masks or we want people to get vaccinated. Let's ask people who study persuasion, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That would have been
but you know what?
It's not too late.
Right. Yeah. There's another crisis coming down the road. So one of the lessons we can learn is let's get the social scientists involved on the ground floor.
For the marketing and persuasion. That's a great point. Yes. So back to Ukraine real quick. Negotiations is part of your thing. And I remember doing the negotiating classes at the business school. That was really good for me. I'm not a great negotiator. I learned that, and man's got to know his limitations, but it's a fascinating skill. Actually, I think I can do pretty good because when negotiating, what I really try and do is understand what they want and figure out if there's a way that we can get both sides something. And sometimes you have things that really aren't that important to you. Well, and you can give those away if that makes them better. I think splitting the difference is often a bad technique, but so anyway, those are things that I learned, but you're the expert, and I don't see how you're going to have some kind of negotiated settlement or they'll just fight forever. But Zelensky's not going to give up territory and Putin's not going to accept not getting territory. I don't think so. What are your thoughts on that? How do we negotiate through this?
Yeah, I think a lot of people who know a lot about negotiations are feeling very hopeless right now.
Yeah.
Because, one of the great barriers to effective conflict negotiation is public attention, right? So if you look at labor union negotiations, if you look at, the Middle East, if you look at Northern Ireland, things work better when the leaders can sort of strike a private deal and then go and sell it to their parties separately. When the whole world is staring at it and it becomes, it's a matter of justice and fairness and sort of violation of, human dignity on one side and sort of the great legacy of an aging dictator on the other side, right? Nobody is willing to give an inch. One thing that I did read, actually from one of my senior colleagues at the Kennedy School, it may be Joe Nye, but I may be giving credit to the wrong person. But there was an op-ed that came out a couple of weeks ago that said, look, maybe the way this could work out is if there was sort of a, demilitarization line where nobody agrees on giving up territory.
Right.
They just say, we're going to pause the fighting on this line. And then you kind of like kick the can down the road. Basically, I mean, Northern Ireland doesn't have a proper, a real peace agreement. But like for years, you just kick the can down the road until the conflict cools down.
Korea doesn't.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no, Korea is still at war. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So you stop the violence along some boundary, and then both sides can feel like, they got whatever. And then hopefully, you wait for Russia to solve its Putin problem.
That is the only long-term solution. And I don't think that's going to happen. That's a great idea. So maybe just make the Donbass.
Again, not my idea.
Well, it's Joe Nye, the conflict guy, not Bill Nye, the science guy. It's a good idea. That was Putin's goal, right? To demilitarize. And so here it is. Let's demilitarize it. Get your military out of there.
Right.
But I mean, the things happening are so horrendous. I'm on some I'm on some Telegram channels in Russian language that are just incredible. It's the other way to negotiate, back to the Star Wars metaphors, which I wasn't planning on, but I forgot which episode it was. One of the 90s movies, they talked about aggressive negotiations. Basically, the Jedi just went in there and kicked ass, and that's one way to negotiate. But I don't think there's going to be there's not going to be a decisive military victory on either side, because we just didn't arm Ukraine enough, so they can't decisively beat the Russians, and the Russians are inept enough, and they're not going to beat the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians don't want them there. Right. So it's either going to be long-term conflict just festering for years, like it has been for the last 8 years, or they need to have some type of DMZ. That's a great thing. Maybe the UN could have peacekeepers there to, I don't know. It just seems like without Putin gone, there's not going to be anything. And then what do you think about that? Because the post-Putin, the next Putin, guy may not be better. I don't know that there's not a long line of democratic Russians, ready to take power. I don't know. Maybe there is.
Well, I think this is where, obviously depends on how the next guy comes to be the next guy. Right. But hopefully the next guy is a good politician and has a sense of what keeps him in power and what his people are interested in, right? And so then we're back to the problem of how do you shape the perception of the Russian people of what the conflict is about and the West, right? So right now we're applying sanctions to sort of squeeze Putin and the oligarchs, but of course, a different version of that story that they're pushing in Russia is that the West is against Russians. Right. And so, so if the story sort of on the streets is our government has created this situation, that's one story. If the story is the West, this is quote unquote Western aggression, that's a different story. Right. And I think the environment that next person walks into will very much determine, how they behave.
The thing is, the West really wanted Russia to democratize. We were hopeful. This International Space Station was a program to basically give money to Russia to promote them. The West had such high hopes for Russia, and Putin in the 2000s. George W. Bush said, "I looked into his eyes and I saw the soul of a good man," or whatever. Like, there was a lot of hope. Right. And my take on it is whenever you get a diagnosis of cancer, you need to cut it out, or it's going to not get better. It's like a letter from lawyers. They don't, if you ignore them, it doesn't get better. And Russia had that diagnosis in 2008 when Putin decided that he was going to ignore the Constitution and stay in power. The warning flags were, in my mind, and in their mind, should have been going off. They didn't do anything about it. And I know it's hard. I know Putin kills journalists. I know it's brutal. You get arrested. But the alternative is you end up here, destroying, killing Ukrainians and ruining your country and your brand forever. They had the cancer diagnosis and they didn't do anything about it. And in my mind, this is really the 21st century problem for the earth, because there's authoritarians and there's democracies, and we need to get democracy has been faltering. We need to get that on track, because the alternative is not pretty.
Right. Well, and I think, to me, I mean, that's terrifying, but, some version of this has happened forever. I think what part of the trouble, right, is that we need to clean up our own house, right? We need to get Americans on the same page about vaccines and stolen elections and
yes,
the value of democracy and value
what happens in America,
all those good things.
Absolutely. That's even more important than Russia. The fate of the American democracy is the most important issue of the world. We had a cancer diagnosis in 2016, by the way, in America. So are we able to cut that out or not is a big, and I say that, look, I stuffed envelopes for Ronald Reagan. I'm a very conservative guy in many ways, but we had a cancer diagnosis in 2016. We need to make sure that cancer doesn't come back. I think that's my take. Yeah.
Well, and back to my high horse. We need to understand why those people voted the way they did and why many of them still feel like that was the right thing to do. Right. And sort of, talking down to them and preaching to them has not helped.
Right.
So what else can we do? How can we engage the country in a common, thoughtful conversation? Yeah.
I mean, I think, look, there are issues, and the immigration's important and the economy is important and so on. And I would say, let's not borrow trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, and high taxes are bad, but let's not try and overthrow the government too. So let's maybe address those needs while being a moral person. that would be my way to do it.
There's a lot of talk these days about polarization.
Yeah.
Right? So America is more polarized than it's ever before. Political scientists argue about it all day long. Are we more polarized? Are we the same polarized? How do you measure it? All that stuff. There's another thing that's less well known, but incredibly important. And it's this idea of false polarization. And what false polarization is people believing that those on the other side are further apart than they actually are. So this started out as old research, actually by my former PhD advisor, Lee Ross. And that research was done around the fall of the Berlin Wall, where they asked East Germans and West Germans their attitudes about a bunch of issues. And what they found is that people thought the other side was more extreme and more homogenous than the other side actually was.
Right.
And that was the case in the Berlin Wall. And that is hugely the case in America today. So when you, in one breath say, there was a cancer diagnosis in 2016, but also I'm a pretty conservative guy and immigration is a problem and, borrowing trillions of dollars is a bad idea, it makes you sound like a complete nuanced person with lots of complicated policy views on, that differ by issue, right? Yeah. Whereas most of the time what we do is we stereotype the people on the other side, right? And we say, look, the people on the left all believe in, big government, no border control,
right,
borrow all the money, so we don't engage with the other side, partly because we think that they're kind of a caricature of themselves.
Right. When they're evil, yeah, you don't negotiate with evil. And
well, they're evil, or they're stupid,
right.
or their views are way, way, way too extreme to be taken
Right.
seriously. And so once you have a conversation, you say, you know what, we actually could solve things together because you're a much more reasonable human than I expected you to be.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of a radical moderate. I think I'm a central, and I was a math major, and we learned about the bell curve, right? There's extremes on the right and extremes on the left, but most things are in the middle, and that's true. That's true for batting averages in baseball, and weight and life expectancy, just everything on earth that comes down to a bell curve. Most things do. But the way our political system has become this bimodal distribute, like there's the right and the left and there's nothing in the middle. So do you think people really are a bell curve when it comes to most political views?
Yeah, absolutely. People, the interesting idea about being a radical moderate, and I think there's a lot of people in the middle who are sort of just disengaged and don't care.
Yeah.
Right. Which is very different than saying I am informed and I care a lot and I see things from both sides. But I think the reason we have this feeling of a bimodal distribution is because people on the extremes are yelling the loudest. Right. I mean, I'm not like the first one to have that idea, right? There's lots of people saying, but look, it's the extreme voices that are getting amplified. But if you just talk to your conservative Aunt Irene, she's gonna turn out to be a reasonable lady with some goofy ideas. Mm-hmm. Right. And that conversation is not going to be nearly as bad as you expect it to be. So I have a paper from a couple years ago with Todd Rogers, who's a colleague of mine at the Kennedy School, and Charlie Dorison, who was one of our former PhD students, where we literally ask people, what is it going to be like to listen to a campaign ad from Ted Cruz? And liberals are like, oh my God, it's going to be like, awful. And then we make them listen to the campaign ad. And they're like, oh, well, it wasn't great. I don't agree, but it wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
Right. And that's like a very, very robust pattern. It's not nearly as bad as you think it's going to be, because people are not nearly as extreme as you think they are, because we've been listening to the people screaming on Twitter, not just talking to our friends and family.
Right. I had a lady named Catherine Gale. I met her at a lecture. She was giving a lecture at Harvard, and she's a political scientist. She has some techniques to try and allow moderates top 5 voting and ranked choice voting. And there's some practical ways. Alaska did it. New York City has done this. They're just ways that force candidates to appeal to both sides, not just their radical primary voters. But that, with all the gerrymandering that's been going on and stuff, it's like we've been given this huge blessing of this incredible country, and we're doing our best to try and destroy it, which makes my head explode. But we need to figure out a way to probably through your psychological techniques, to talk to people and not demonize them. But I tell you, if you watch Fox News all day long, Joe Biden is Satan. And if you watch MSNBC all day long, Republicans are crazy right-wing radicals that you can't talk to. And that's the problem. And back in this, and I remember 20 years ago, it hit me, and it's certainly come to pass. But back in the day, we all watched Walter Cronkite. So everybody at least there were liberals and conservatives, but everybody at least had a foundation of information. But now you don't have that at all. And Fox is the master at inflaming anger. And you're probably, I've been told and read that anger and hate gets 5 times more clicks on Facebook than positivity and love and stuff. Is that a psychological truth?
Yeah. So there's something called the negativity bias. Where negative information draws attention much more than positive information, right? So
Yeah.
people are very sensitive and very reactive to negative emotions, negative imagery. And it kind of makes sense from sort of a, evolutionary perspective,
Yeah.
right? But you can certainly abuse it. And if your goal is to generate clicks and make money, then, that's the downside of involving social scientists in.
There's 5 multi-trillion-dollar companies that I can think of that do that.
Right.
Well, Julie, I know we're out of time. I would love to talk for hours. This is amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're very busy. By the way, congrats on the op-ed and Time today, and all the other work that you're doing. It's important. Like, the world literally depends on it. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you very much for having me. This was a terrific conversation.
It was a lot of fun. Bye-bye.
Bye.